Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Hi, this is Dan.
And this is Cathy Loerzel.
And Cathy, do you know that the two of us wrote a book that's coming out this fall? I'm assuming you do, but I want to just say, we wrote a book together.
We wrote a book. It's called Redeeming Heartache. And we really wrote it for anyone who's struggling with unaddressed pain from their past and who wants to understand why they're struggling with what they're struggling with in the present. And this book will help you understand how the story of your wounding is not a failure or something that can't be understood, but it's an invitation to your purpose and your divine calling. And it is available for pre-order right now. And if you pre-order it before its release date of September 14th, you get bonus content, Dan.
Does that include that you'll show up at people's homes and make them dinner?
I would love to do that. People should just let me know when they need dinner and I will show up. I'm an Italian grandma at heart.
No, the extra content is just us reflecting on some of the core themes of the book. And really, our task is to say that to name the truth about life is a risky walk on the wild side. But look, when adversity and suffering are significant, that wild walk of engaging the reality of trauma is really the only way we're going to see life itself.
So if you want to join us in our celebration of the book, we're actually doing a live conference based on the content of the book. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners, we're talking about orphan, widow, stranger, and redeeming those parts of ourselves into prophet, priest, and king and queen. It's going to be a great day, September 18th. So buy the book, come to the conference, and it's not just for folks who have read the book. Really, we're going to cover a lot of the content, and then it'll be a great way to move you into the book when it arrives on your doorsteps.
Look, I'm not usually the one to deal with details, but nonetheless, what date is this event happening, Cathy?
September 18th. September 18th. It'll be a lot of fun.
Well, soon after that, Cathy and I and my wife Becky are packing up and heading out to Montana to do an intimate mystery conference. And we'll be doing that October 1st and 2nd in Bozeman, Montana, one of the finest places in the world to fly fish. But if you're unable to travel to Montana, we still have the option for you to attend the event from the comfort of your own home with a live stream ticket, but that live stream ticket will not enable you to do any fly fishing.
Or hang out with me, Dan, and the team. We are so excited to get back on the road. Even in the midst of this craziness, we are excited to see all of your faces. Intimate Mystery is a unique weekend that invites you into a place of newfound awareness and ability to engage conflict and desire in any type of relationship. So it's for partners, couples, people who are wanting to get into a relationship, even people who are working through the edges of divorce. This is one of those spaces that will help you understand your own style of relating and how you do that within relationships.
Yeah, it's so important to underscore that this is invitation to understand what intimacy calls forth, uniquely in marriage, but in all relationships, including a relationship with God. You can find more information about these events and more about our work at www, like 3 W's and a dot, and then the AllenderCenter.org. Looking forward to being with you. Welcome, folks, to a bit of a different podcast. Rachel's not with us, but the co-author of the new book that I am part of, Redeeming Heartache, How Past Suffering Reveals Our True Calling. Cathy Loerzel, it is so good to have you join me in an unusual setting, and that is our boss, Dr. James Derek McNeil, the president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, a remarkable human being. I'm about to turn over the role that I normally have as being the privileged interviewer. I get to be interviewed by this illustrious presence, Dr. McNeil. So, Derek, welcome. Cathy, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm, first of all, delighted to be with both of you and real pleased and excited about this book. It's wonderful to think about the timing of this book. This is the 10th anniversary of the Allender Center. And we look forward to a huge celebration this coming year around this work, the ideas, and in some ways the maturing. I think of this book as the culmination of a set of years of work and a number of things. Dan, this is your 19th or 21st. We couldn't decide if it was the 20th, so we said 19th or 21st. And book. And Cathy, this is your first. And so congratulations to you both. I want to begin just by asking the question, which I think our timing begs the question, why now? And not just simply around anniversary, but why now in this time of our social cultural history? Why this book and why now?
Gosh, I mean, we started writing this book, or the idea of this book came about far before the pandemic. And, this material that we cover in the book, really, Dan, you've been writing on this stuff in a lot of your books over time, right? And so this material is really the connection point to a lot of the different material that you've been working on over the last couple of years. And so I got to join you to kind of bring it all together. And that's been a gift. I don't know that we really understood the timing of it all before we started writing it. But, I think part of the gift of what you've brought into this world, Dan, is that you've always been a little bit further out in your prophetic voice in terms of sexual abuse in the church and people's lives. The idea that trauma is embedded in everything that we do, that the idea that none of us can escape the fall. You've been out on the front lines talking about this for a long time. And now those things are coming more into the center of the zeitgeist of the human experience. We understand all of that to be true, whether it's just based on how much we're exposed to it on a daily basis or how much we've started to tell more of the truth of what has happened with the human condition. But, this book, Dan and I, we knew that we wanted to get this material out there because it was at the core of so much of what we taught at the Allender Center. But then as we started to write it, the pandemic hit. And my goodness, we started the project in your house. And that was really the first meeting that we had around the book was really our last meeting for like a half a year.
Yeah, or a little longer. In 2019, we had begun. And so when COVID and all the heartbreaking consequences, literally, we did almost all our work together through this both horrible and wonderful gift of Zoom. So, it's been a traumatizing process to write on trauma. And in that process, thank goodness that Cathy and I had been engaging and teaching a lot of this material well before, and to concretize it into print in some ways was actually much harder than I thought it was going to be, in part because of COVID, in part because of being traumatized through all that was going on in the year 2020. And I found it really strangely helpful. I found the material helpful before, but writing on it opened the door to even more.
There's a certain awareness that happens as you're living in a degree of, and I'll call collective trauma, all of us in terms of pandemic, and then writing about personal experiences of trauma and healing. And curious as you talk about your process together, and it would be a very different process. One person's got 19 or 21 under their belt, and the other person, this is their first. And so curious about the process for the two of you as you talk about writing in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on Dan saying yes to writing this book with me, that was a huge risk for him. When I look back, I mean, I have written a few blogs here and there. I've written a lot of proposals, a lot of business plans, and I've developed the content and the material of the Allender Center over the last decade. But it is quite a different thing to write a book than it is to teach, than it is to have a slide deck, than it is to get up in front of folks. And frankly, looking back, I don't know that I knew what I was getting into. And I don't know that I really knew I could do it. And so I think part of the miracle of the book is that a first-time author was able to connect with someone who has so much experience, and Dan's generosity in being able to share his material, let me develop more of it, go back and forth. Like, it was such a gift to be able to write this book with him. I mean, it is really, when I look back over the last 2 years, it is the highlight of joy and delight and goodness, and also challenge to take things that have been in our bodies and in the way we breathe and the way we see the world, and then find the right story that goes with it, to find the language to explain, these complicated areas of how we have trauma in our lives and what we do to resolve it. So I again, I'll say again, thank you to Dan for taking a shot. And Dan is, you may not know this about Dan, but he is very disciplined in how he approaches his work. And that may not come across sometimes because it feels like he's just kind of talking, but he was on me from the very beginning of like, okay, girl, like, where's this chapter? And you are behind, and I need to see your writing, and what's your plan? And, that's pretty intimidating to have Dan Allender.
A new side of him that we haven't seen as often as we've seen. What?
I appear slovenly? Is that the bottom line?
No, just more, you take moments and yeah, no, not sloven. However, this was a new side of you.
Let me go back to two things. The first is there was no risk on my part at all, because I've watched how you engage hard material, both personally, corporately, and I've read your writing. And I think even watching how an email gets crafted is a way. So I appreciate you saying that, but it didn't feel like a risk. And to underscore, nobody writes a book. There is no such thing as writing a freaking book. You write sentences, you write paragraphs, you don't write a book. But the closest thing you do is you have a developmental editor. And to say that we have been blessed by, I think, a genius of geniuses, and that is Tracy Mullins, came alongside of us. And every book I have written with her, I grow as a writer. Yeah. And I know that she was a deep, sweet ally for you, Cathy, for you to hear you're a good writer. And also, here are areas you need to grow in. So I think anyone who thinks of a book as anything other than a community, even an individual author has at least one, if not 2 to 3 editors. And that process, I have often felt like the editor ought to be on the masthead of the book just as much as the so-called editors.
Absolutely.
But we laud her in the acknowledgement section. But, and then having friends, I won't go through every name, but having people read and go, well, that sucks, is really helpful. I mean, it may not be the sweetest words you're going to hear in a particular day, but it is so important that though we're responsible for the inadequacies of the book, we don't blame anybody, including the editors. But nonetheless, we could not have written I would never be able to write a so-called book if I didn't have help in writing sentences and paragraphs, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate the way that the two of you have kind of brought out this sort of process of making that which we know known. And, the editor, I think, having worked on a couple pieces, the editor and family, friends, people who both challenge and sit with, and we've also named the context, a context of trauma. So I think all that goes into shaping and birthing a sort of unique piece of something. And so let's turn a little bit and talk about the book itself and what the two of you had hoped in this project and the message that you want to pull out and draw out for people to, in other words, that known thing that what is it you want to be known of this piece?
Well, I love the subtitle because it does say, generally speaking, what I most want to say. How past suffering, how past trauma, how the incursion of our world, and we use 3 archetypes, how the experience of being an orphan and a stranger and a widow or widower actually sets a trajectory. And I'll put it pretty bluntly, either a trajectory of denial and an effort to escape the reality of living in a fallen world, or that there is some engagement. And again, what the word engagement implies is a lot, but an owning, a naming, an embracing, a transforming of that suffering into a sense of, damn it, I want to do harm to that which is unjust, unmerciful, lacking humility. I want to stand against that. And I want to grow something of justice, something of mercy and humility on this earth. And obviously I'm reflecting Micah 6:8. So that framework of being able to say, our calling is where we say, hell no. And where something in us says, I believe I am meant to create something kind, sweet, and good on this earth for myself and for others. That's what we wanted to accomplish.
For me, I started in 2004 with Dan as a student. Showed up at the threshold of what was then Marsville Graduate School, which is now the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. Had never heard of Dan. I'm not really quite sure. It was a miracle of what got me to the front door in the first place, mostly because of Abby Wong-Hefter, who you've heard before on this podcast. But when I showed up, I was really on a journey searching for language that could explain what had happened to me and what I was seeing happen in other people's lives. And when I showed up in Dan's class, the class that he taught our first year was called Faith, Hope, and Love. And I remember sitting in that class and again, I hadn't read any of his books. I didn't know who he was, but the gift of being able to have someone offer you language and reorientation back to what you've known was true in your own body, in your story, in your suffering. But when you don't have language or explanation, it leaves you so isolated and struggling to find meaning, to find hope, to find purpose. And Dan's categories of orphan, widow, and stranger, and then their redemptive arc into prophet, priest, and king, offered me something not just about naming what was true and giving me a way to translate my experiences into something that felt more universal. One, I didn't feel alone. I felt like I could start to put my story back together, but it also gave me a capacity to bridge and actually move into the redemptive arc of the gospel that didn't feel cheap, that didn't feel like you were skipping over suffering, that you weren't moving into something too quickly, that didn't feel resolved. Like it held the tension of the heartache and the agony that is true in each of our lives, but it didn't leave us there. It gave us a bridge. And it's not an easy bridge. it's one of suffering and heartache and understanding, but man, is it a beautiful bridge. And I think that's why we wrote the book, was because the gift of language, the gift of stories that help us translate our own lives. It's really what Scripture does for us as well. And it's not to say that the book is like Scripture, but I think it's borrowing off of something of the gospel story that says your life is knowable if you can find language, can find God in the midst of it, and also can find a community that can help move you towards God. But that has to happen through remembering what was true about what you've suffered and what you continue to suffer. So I think that's why, that's the hope, is that for me, it's very personal. My hope is that what I experienced at the school, what I've experienced engaging with Dan and the other people at the Allender Center, what I've experienced from you, Derek, that we can then take that and offer that out to other people to maybe help give them language for what's true about their lives.
Mm-hmm. I deeply appreciate this sort of metaphor, Cathy, using a bridge, the bridge between, and that's often the tough part of getting from one side of something to the other, from moving from orphan, widow, stranger to priest, prophet, priest, and king. And I'll ask you some questions about that. But I also hear in this, Dan, when you talk about heartache, and what comes to me about heartache is despair. Redeeming despair, redeeming a sort of grief of hopelessness, of hearts broken in such a way that there is no putting it back together. And in some ways you're saying, hey, it's important to identify, hey, what's my story, the heartbreak story, even to produce a possibility of a redemptive story. And that's that bridge. So I'd love to hear you both talk a bit about that bridge. And some might call it that theory of change, or some might talk about it as that, how do we get from one side of this bridge to the other? What's that help, that holding?
Well, for me, at least, part of the answer to that is, what's the gap between the two sides? And in that sense, that's what we would put words to as the effects of trauma. Not all heartache is trauma, but all trauma brings some degree of heartache. And in that sense, you've got these three classic words: fragmentation. Whenever we're in a significant level of heartache, our mind, our brain will not operate as it does when we're not. In other words, we fragment. We have a divide, a gap between, in some ways, our left and right hemisphere, in our limbic system, between our amygdala and our hippocampus, or between our limbic system and our cortical system. Again, not to bore you, but the bottom line is there's division. There's a gap. And that gap is pretty sizable when we're fragmenting. And when you add to that when we're beginning to, in some sense, internally, externally dissolve, we dissociate, we numb down. And yet the numbing often results in even greater rage. And in one sense, blame shifting. So we go between our own disappointment and our own blame shifting, and we just cut off, we isolate. So when we know what we're trying to bridge, the reality is when we are experiencing that sense of being an orphan, or strange and weird, we don't fit, or that the love that we most want, we have lost, or it is now replaced by some level of accusation. I mean, we all have structures of survival that we have learned deeply, no matter how good our family of origin was. We learned how to somehow survive, and not just in our families, but in the larger culture. We've learned how to survive in systems like schools or peer groups. But those survival structures at one level are stunningly beautiful because they kept us alive, but they're also so deeply broken. So part of the reality is, can we name what's true? Can we just name, I am not doing well, I'm fragmenting, I am so without feeling here, or I am just on the border of rage, if not in it? Can I name what is true? Can I name that I'm really lonely, and I'm really, really hurt that I'm alone? All those categories leave us back to so few times can we name the truth, let alone name the truth in the presence of another human being. So to name it for ourselves, as egregiously difficult as it is, seems almost Herculean to be able to say that to somebody, even that you know, loves you, cares for you, let alone somebody who might join the fragmentation by some level of accusation. So I think the first step, though, I don't think we think in steps. We think in terms of trajectories and processes. We have to name the truth, and that's going to be a lifetime process. But I'll never begin to build a bridge. I'll never be able to get to the other side if I don't come to name something is deeply wrong, not just with my world, not just with other people, but something is deeply not well in my own being. So I'll let Cathy handle the rest.
Perfect. Thanks. You know, I think I love the idea of the scripture that says the truth will set you free. But then the other one that Dan always brings up is also, it's the kindness of God that leads you to repentance. And I think when we start to land into the truth of both the brokenness and the beauty of the world, we're often not prepared to handle what we discover. And I think we're starting to realize just how important it is for us to be radically committed to healing. If we want to see like any of the part of the kingdom actually come alive today, right? I think God is as capable of bringing the goodness of the kingdom to come no matter what, but I think our call is to participate. And if we're meant to participate, we need to be more healed and more connected to what's true about our own faith, and also about what's true about other people and what's going on in the world, so that we can actually join in the grief and then also the redemptive arc. And so, as I've been writing this book and then talking about it and, doing my own Instagram feeds and all the things that are required of you as you try to promote a book, I talk about grief more often now than I ever have. Although if I go back to my old blogs, turns out I was talking about it then as well. I just didn't realize it. And I don't know that there's anything that will get us to redemption other than sorrow and grief and lament. But in order for sorrow and grief to come, we have to be willing to let the truth of our own stories, both in what's been done to us and also what we've done to others, actually come to reside in our consciousness, and then allow there to be something of the holy work of holding it long enough to allow your body to sink into what's true, not so that we just sink into despair, but actually so that we can move into a true, authentic hope. And that's, so I think I have tried every version of trying to skirt grief. I mean, I will overwork, I will overdrink, I will overcommit, I will dissociate, I will isolate, I will try to put on a happy face, and all of those ways of dealing with the world are ways that kept me safe in my family of origin. But now as an adult, we have the opportunity to actually grow in our health and our ways of relating to the world. But if we don't, one, recognize what we've done to try to deny the horror of what it means to exist, if we deny that, then we will also then deny what actually happened to us in our origin that shattered something of what we know to be true about what we deserve or what we actually need in our bodies to feel safe. And so the invitation that we're working on in this book is, will you go back and start to name more of the truth of what happened? And will you start to understand how that impacted how you see the world? And will you allow there to be grief and a drop that will then move you into a redemptive arc that is more true and can actually bring something of the healing God to bear more in the world?
I think it's one of the reasons why the categories of orphan and stranger and widow are so important, because, we're not the first people on the earth to suffer.
Right.
And the reality is, the Hebrew Bible gives some profound archetypes for telling the truth. But unfortunately, we get real concrete. And go, well, my parents are alive or were alive. I'm not an orphan. I'm not from another country. I'm not a stranger. I'm married or I'm not married. My spouse is alive. I'm not a widower. And it's like, yes, those are very concrete categories, but they also describe the reality of living in a fallen world for everyone. And that, I think, is one of the significant powers of this book, is that we invite people into a reflection of what it means to be an orphan, a stranger, and a widow, that I think, from what I've heard from friends who have encountered the book, has been distressing but illuminating, and oddly, and they have used that phrase, oddly freeing, to be able to see themselves in light of that kind of profound biblical archetype.
I'm struck again by the potency of story, my life story. And there is, in some ways, the ability to reorient around orphan, widow, and stranger that does provide some comfort. Even it helps me to recognize my story, both to have some sense that I am not alone in that sense of loss or that sense of distress or that sense of grief, and that others have grieved, and the possibility that the story can be altered, which is what you're saying. So that notion of naming what is true, it's naming what is true of my story, and then naming that story in the context of others, that I need to, in some ways, to be in the presence. And then also I hear you saying acceptance, and acceptance of God first and foremost, and then acceptance of self. The ability to begin to, in some ways, Cathy, use the word authentic. Authentic in some full way means I can see me and hold what I see. Mm-hmm. I can tolerate even what other people see in me and hold those pieces too. And that's difficult, challenging for us. But I love the way this is couched in the sort of narrative arc. It is an arc, if you will, beginning, middle, and end, a movement, because it allows us to have some hope and maybe resist some of the challenges of grief. Deep pieces. And what, as you think about what you're offering people in terms of their stories, looking at them reflectively, telling themselves and others the truth, putting themselves in front of God, and what are the I think I want to ask the sort of, what are the parts that touch you, that resonate with your stories? In other words, you're sharing a bit of your known. What resonates with you as you share with other people around their stories?
Well, let me go back to a comment that Cathy made and tie it to what you just asked, Eric. Like acceptance, I love that word, but I think a lot of people actually mistake what acceptance is to a kind of resignation. like, this is the way it is. Okay. I guess I better accept it. I know that's not how you're using the word, but if we can come back to that notion of kindness, kindness is not something that I would say I have experienced an immense amount in my family of origin, and I married, I think, one of the kindest human beings I've ever known in my life. And so kindness has been a growing reality over 44, 45 years of marriage. But when we talk about knowing your story, it's knowing your story with the ferocity of Jesus's kindness. So that kindness is, can I come to my story? And again, using Cathy's term, can I come to my own story with grief, not bitter grief, not bitter disappointment, but kind sorrow? And can I indeed engage my own failure of others, not with self-justification or contemptuous cruelty, but with kindness, with a kindness that allows me to grieve as I believe the Father, the Son, the Spirit grieve on my behalf. And that, I remember reading one or two of Cathy's first chapters where I won't tell her story or the story that she shared about her son, but I just wept. It was such a heartbreaking story. And again, a story of significant struggle in a school setting. But it was the way she wrote that allowed my heart not just to feel for her son, but for her and that process. So the reality of being able to be with a storyteller and writer like Cathy that knows she struggles with kindness and grief, but also wants desperately to offer that to her own son. So often it is what we want to become that exposes what we're not. And that seems like it's only going to lead to pressure and demand, but it has the potential to lead to, oh, I want to be so much better of a man. And that desire actually puts words to the reality of what I need for my own heart to become that. And I think the stories, and I won't go to many more, but that particular story, our two major editors, our agent, almost everyone who's read the book will come back to that as a life-changing story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And, this book, like I've had to go back and reread parts of it as, we're looking at quotes and kind of remembering, and the process of writing a book is so bizarre because it almost feels like it's something other than you. I don't remember writing this book. Like I don't remember putting that language to it. It felt like something that was in me that was almost beyond where I actually was, that was offering myself back to me. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I truly, like, I'll look back and be like, did Tracy, our editor, write this? Because I don't remember. This is beautiful and profound. And I don't think I'm capable of using this sort of language, and that's not self-deprecating. I think it's something about a book becomes something outside of you once the language is put down, which is why I think books and writing are so powerful, because it really goes beyond an author. It becomes something else in and of itself. And I think for me, these categories of orphan, widow, stranger, and prophet, priest, and queen and king are so, have been so helpful to me in my life. And the privilege of then being able to put language around them to maybe offer something that they could help other people too. Like I've been writing a lot about the orphan and the priest this week. And I weep every time I go back to those chapters in the book. And priest in particular. And I think the privilege of being able to write about something you long to become more of and to grow in feels very, very vulnerable and very sweet. And the tenderness when you truly approach something that you long to become and long to grow into. And so, when Dan and I teach this material, we're always, like, well, which one are you? Are you a priest? Are you a prophet? Are you a king or a queen? And, I'm much more of a queen, in terms of the archetype than I have been a priest, but my heart is most tender towards the priest because it is where Jesus is calling me to grow and to move. And I think in some ways the book continues to minister to me because it's like almost a reflection back of the promise of God of saying, you're not done yet. And there's no demand or no judgment, but there's also a sense of deep longing and desire and invitation to become more. And I think, those orphan stories that we all have are so poignant, right? The orphan is really is the part of us that was told, your needs are not going to be met and there's no one coming. So you have to figure out how to care for yourself. And if you need more than what you're able to offer yourself, then shut those needs down and don't let them see the light of day. You need to control, you need to manage, and you need to be able to only need what you can give yourself. That is such a setup, one, that kept everyone alive and able to function in worlds that were not caring for their heart well. But as you grow up, there is a part of our hearts that needs and longs and can actually receive goodness from others in relationship, but we are bound to those orphan parts of our heart if we don't recognize this is what was required of me. I'm terrified now of good care. I'm terrified now of what it's going to cost me to receive goodness from other people because I'm afraid that the other shoe is going to drop in the next second, or there's going to be violence, or now I'm exposed to harm because I actually am accepting my own need, right? So I'm sinking a little bit further into orphan. We could have the same conversation around stranger or widow, but what it helps us do is lean further into the stories that have marked us and trained us on how to be in the world. And now there's something different. So as I've looked at orphan, part of my role is to become more of the priest. The priest is the one that's meant to hold the whole story. So often for an orphan, they can't know the whole story because it would destroy them. They can't recognize as a child that their parents can't actually love them the way that they deserve to be loved, or else it would destroy the very fabric that they need to survive. But the priest is meant to come in and care for that orphan and allow there to be more truth told, holding of the grief, holding the space open enough to be able to sink into those feelings and be safe and tell the story, tell the full story of what it meant. And so, for me, that's been very personal for me in this season, is my own capacity to hold the whole story without flinching and without becoming defensive. And for each of you, as you potentially read this book, my guess is that you'll have a different part that will hit home for you. But for me, those are the categories that have been deeply moving and have continued to shift how I heal.
Mm-hmm. I think it's beautiful, that sort of transition. Again, as you talk about the orphan and priest and that movement, and I'll kind of lead us in that direction. But some of the things I hear that really stand out is that not just only can we aspire, hope, pray, trust God to help us become orphan to priest, but we actually need priest with the orphans, that the communal quality of that comes out as well, is the sense of, I need as an orphan priest to hold me, to bear some of this, to accept parts of me that maybe I have a hard time accepting in of myself. Yep. And Dan, I love the distinction. It's not resignation. It is much more full-bodied, full-spirited, fullness of being seen and known in a certain type of way. And I think that then, because I do think grief is a part of living, but we're talking about not moving into despair, if I can make that distinction. Grief, there is things to grieve in this life, the fallenness. But how do we avoid hopelessness? And this movement, to see myself as an orphan being held by other priests, is also a piece of that not being alone piece that we talked about earlier. I want to see if we can talk a little bit more about prophet, priest, king, and queen as we make in that transition. This is the other side of the bridge, if you will. What stands out? What sort of things emerge for you personally, again, in terms of those identities as desired selves, if you will, and that are poignant for you?
Well, when we began the Allender Center, Cathy and I pretty quickly came to name the fact that she's a queen and has significant gifts as a prophet and maybe not so strong as a priest. I'm a prophet, but I've got some priestly gifts, and I have no interest and desire to exercise any kingly leadership. So, what a perfect setup. Cathy's a great queen. I've got strong words and message. I'm a prophet, and organizationally, you run things and tell me where to go, and I'm glad to do it. Well, that worked up to a point. And because I remember the day where Cathy looked at me and basically said, you're a king, you need to show up. It was not a wonderful moment, but it was also clear we are all meant to be like Jesus. That is, we're all meant to be prophets, priests, and kings and queens. You don't get to choose one and eschew the other two or a portion of either. Maturity is to be priestly in remembering, prophetically in arousing desire and exposing injustice, and kingly and queenly, a gifting presence that allows others to flourish because you've created an infrastructure to allow goodness to grow. Okay, but if you knew my story, I ended up having to be in charge, at least by age 6, to some degree, mentally ill parents. I don't like having to make decisions, or I don't like what comes as a result of being a leader. And that is, you're going to be ripped apart, and you're going to be accused, doubted, or seen to be the most wonderful human being in the universe. In other words, the split between accusation and idealization. That's what I lived with in my family, between always being wrong and being the greatest thing that ever walked on the earth. That was madness. And I knew both sides of that insanity were not true. So who in God's name wants to be a leader? So you can see in some ways, this whole process has been and is meant to be deeply redemptive for Cathy, deeply redemptive for me. But that's going to require exposure, failure. It's going to require, in many ways, disruption. So that process of being disrupted in what we're good at and the exposure of where we've got our own stories that are hindering us from becoming who we're meant to be and what we're meant to create. That has been, and is always, sometimes we use words that offend our readers, or listeners, but it's been a shit show. And if that's too troubling, it's been a lot of poo-poo. So the process of writing, the process of living, creating the Allender Center, it's had that, oh my gosh, I got to become more of a king. I've got to lean more into being a priest. And I need prophets who are telling me more of the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the communal aspect of all three, in some ways we need to be working towards, like Dan said, developing all three in our lives and understanding what has happened that have kept those other parts at bay or further away from integrating. And yet we will naturally have inclinations towards one or two that are good. But we then need to make sure we're building teams and collective and leadership structures that allow for all three voices to be at the table. And so, we write about this in the book where there have been many times where, as the queen, I have had the prophets and the priests within our organization deeply troubled by my leadership and what was happening, and being brave enough to sit and say, hey, this, you're gonna take us over a cliff, and recognizing that they were right and needing to listen, and that's a part of being the king or the queen, is the capacity to listen. And so often those roles become so separate, like elevated away from the ground and away from the voices that actually can penetrate, the tower that you're in. That I think that's part of the fall of leaders, is that you become so removed from the ground that you don't even know how to listen anymore and how to take in. And so I think part of our hope in this book is that we continue the imagination around collective leadership, around the sense of who is at your table, and losing the idea that one person should be the perfect ideation of all three. I was talking to a leadership team and they're like, how much should we expect our leaders to be all three? And I was like, well, it depends on how much of a narcissistic structure you want embedded in your leadership, because there ain't nobody who's all three perfectly except Jesus. But I think there is this sense of, like, because oftentimes the priests in your world aren't always at the leadership table. Not in the way we've designed leadership. They're doing different jobs within your organization, and so can you learn how to develop a space for those voices to come to bear? And those are mistakes I've made as a leader. We're trained to listen to very specific sorts of voices and leaders, in our culture, and that's shifting, thank God. But that's painful, and that's been painful for our organization. And it's not to say we've arrived, we haven't, but the invitation, again, this book in some ways is aspirational. I mean, this last year, Dan and I, there were many moments where he was like, girl, go back and read the Queen chapter. You're kidding me. And I wrote the Queen chapter. So I'm like, oh no. Okay. And I have to go back and learn again and go, oh my gosh, this is happening. Like what I wrote, I'm now living out and I'm not doing it very well. And that, again, that's just true about the human experience. But there's so much hope if we can actually both tend to the parts of ourselves that, in order to access more of the priest, access more of the prophet, access more of the queen, but then also be able to really honor and venerate those voices that need to be more central to the table than they are.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that sort of debunking of, in some ways, cultural myths. You got to do it by yourself. You got to do it alone. You've got to stand out in a certain type of way. If you're not, you won't be seen, which has more to do maybe with the orphan than priest or prophet or king, queen. And some of what you're saying is not just simply the work that I have to do within, but the work I have to do between. And I've got to bring myself to communities that can hold and challenge the sort of single soul assumptions that we are inherently in a process with Christ that is altering both our story and our cellular nature, if you will. And that is the redemptive sort of arc coming to fruition, that we are in some ways relating in such a way, both with ourselves, but also with others, in a way that brings us into these identities and helps us learn a new story. Celebration. I'm going to, as we kind of come to often we don't celebrate well. We don't celebrate the redemptive act, the sort of bridging the gap, the redemptive arc. But what does it mean as we celebrate this book? We celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Allender Center. We celebrate the work that God has been doing in your lives. What does celebration mean as we think about the anniversary and your own stories?
Oh, that's a big one. And I'll start by saying I have the privilege and have had the privilege of working with a number of men and women who have been in the conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the men that I've worked with said to me, celebrating always has to have a place for grief, because when we return from a significant incursion where there were losses, we have to tend to the reality that there's been harm. We've lost good people in the process of these 10 years. And those losses are heartbreaking, and some, I'll just say, due to my own failure. No organization can come to exist without having to deal with debris, and there's debris. And on the other hand, we have done good work, and good work's been done on our behalf. And there has been a deep sense of we are engaging things that need to be engaged personally, and from families, and in the larger collective. So I have this intersection of heartache and incredible hope. And they're both there as I celebrate. Like, we have done well and we have not done well. And we are growing to do better, but the better doesn't take away heartache and harm. It doesn't take away hope and movement. So in one sense, what I can say is celebration. It's not a birthday party. We just celebrated my grandson Gus's 4th birthday. There's no grief. It's just good. And having him blow the candles out and laugh, and then sort of stuck his face. We didn't expect this, but sort of stuck his face into the cake. It was just good, just good. So the nature of the Allender Center is we want to tell the truth, and we don't do that good of a job at it. And we want to hold the hope of the resurrection, and we don't do that good a job of it. But we do a good enough job to be able to say we're offering something that really can change us and collectively can be part of larger changes, both personally and familially and culturally. So in that sense, I stumble into this celebration, weary, oh my God, weary from the battle. And yet, on the other hand, in awe of what we have been privileged to engage in one another's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, going back to for me personally, the journey of moving into priest, categorically, that has been a harder space for me because there are large pieces of my own story, even though I've been doing this work for 17 years, that have been unaddressed. And the invitation of both writing this book, but then also having to become the person, in some ways worthy of it, has meant for me to go back and do the work that I didn't want to do or couldn't do because I was busy building an organization, and it was a great cover for not having to go back. But there is no way that this work for me can move forward, or even the idea of celebrating this marker can happen if I can't tell the whole story, both in my own life. And again, this is it. The good news is that everything we teach, I've found to be true. I can't take anyone further than I've gone myself. And so in some ways, I've had to pause and go back, and tell the truth of my own story. And then allow God and others to help me tell the truth of the story of the Allender Center in a way that is exceedingly more painful, also exceedingly more beautiful, than I could have ever told it in a place of disorientation. And so I wait for the banquet, not knowing when or how that banquet will occur, but also knowing that there is work to be done to be able to mark and to celebrate. And that can look different, for different seasons. And so for me, this celebration gets to be very personal, not public, not grandstanding. It's going to be in my backyard, telling stories and seeing just something of the goodness of God and the mercy that we are all a part of a story that's bigger than ourselves, and that the call is to healing at whatever cost. The call is not to ignore or to make ourselves look better than we are, but it's the freedom of God that is found as our hearts are tender and able to be impacted by both the stunning beauty that's around us and the reality of what it means to be fallen in a fallen world.
And before we end, Derek, Cathy and I dedicated this book to Keith Anderson, the president prior to you, sir. And let me just read what we wrote. To Dr. Keith Anderson, our dear friend, who lovingly beguiled us to form the Allender Center and sent us on a perilous journey that has given us more of Jesus. So in that sense, the celebration is of an entity. Indeed it is. And we have worked very hard to create organizationally material, curriculum, growing personnel, etc. But in some ways, it is more a celebration of people. So in that sense, to say, to Dr. Anderson, damn it. But thank you. And again, we wouldn't exist as an organization without you, Dr. James Derek McNeil. You have shepherded us. You have come alongside of us and borne some of the complexities of this organization in your body. And so in one sense, we celebrate you and the organization that you lead, because the Allender Center is not a separate organization from the Seattle School. We live within and for, sometimes wittingly and unwittingly against, but nonetheless with a sense that we're part of a larger story, as Cathy has said. And to that larger story, we celebrate the goodness of God in the land of the living.
Thank you. One one thing as we close, and deeply appreciate your bringing yourselves to this conversation. And I hear in your stories both the question of what we have been and what we will be, and the gratitude that is also immersed in the grief. And so deeply appreciative of what of yourselves you have brought to the venture. Not just simply telling stories, but telling your stories, bringing yourself to this in a way that would transform and create hope and possibility. And so thank you for redeeming Heartache and the work of both your hearts, minds, spirits, and community. We receive it and celebrate with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.